Hey y'all, it's Weed. Last two chapters of the textbook, chapters 13 and 14 that we're going to be using. Chapter 13 is about substance use and misuse. So we're going to be covering information that you've heard before. There's nothing new here, but it is important for you to reconsider because more than likely you're at a different stage in your life than the first or second or third or fourth time that you heard this. So as a country, do you think we get mixed messages about tobacco, alcohol, and drugs? And if so, what do you think they are? So think about that for a second. So are there two different stories being told about tobacco, alcohol, and drugs? And some people glamorize and make money off of it, and other people are trying to say no, 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 and everything that goes along with that. So consider that as we continue. Great cook, what can I say? That is the part of the Turkish getup after you get to the half kneel and you want to be looking up there at your hand. It's magical. So chapter 12 was about cancer, if you recall, and there was an assignment on discussion board watching Dr. Lee talking about some of the foods that could help to minimize that and also obesity. So explain what cancer is and how it spreads, discuss causes of cancer and how they can be avoided or minimized, and then think about the different forms of cancer. What can you do to protect yourself by having early detection, being diagnosed and treatment? Most forms of cancer, the earlier you find them, the more treatable they are and the longer survivability you have. So this video, a couple years ago, HBO had a series about drugs, and she was one of the people who presented. I believe she's a psychologist. So the link will be in the web page later on. You can listen to that. It's very interesting. She talks about addiction, and being a non-addictive person, it's kind of hard to understand, if you've ever seen Intervention, how people can willingly throw their lives away for an addiction, just stop. But it's a little bit more complex than that. So chapter 13 objectives to define and discuss addiction. What are the major categories of psychoactive drugs and how it can be prevented and treated? What are the short and long-term effects of alcohol? Identify strategies for drinking alcohol responsibly, which is a problem for many college students. I'm going to assume there's some problems at Lone Star College as well as four-year colleges for those of you who are planning on transferring. You probably know people and have heard stories. And then describe strategies to help someone stop smoking. So here's a definition of an addictive behavior. It is compulsive. And again, as I stated, I'm not an addictive person, so I don't understand. If you don't want to do something, don't do it. But it's a little bit different than that. And notice, by pursuing these, we also have marginalization and exclusion of other activities and responsibilities. So a drug is any chemical that affects the structure and function of the body, and a psychoactive drug is one that affects the brain. Do very many people get addicted to aspirin? No. Why not? Because it's a psychoactive drug. So psychoactive drugs affect the functioning of the brain. There are neurotransmitters within the nervous system, and they somehow block the release of that or increase the release of that, and it alters the person's state of mind or consciousness. And an intoxication is when you're at a level where it impairs your ability to think, to move, to act, to walk, to drive, whatever those items might be. There's a link here in the PDF on D2L and also in the Nearpod about a Foundations for a Drug-Free World, and they have some information. I used to use those before. Some of them might be a little bit off the mark, but it's sponsored by Scientology. Not that I have anything against Scientology, but I wondered at first where they came from, and then it made sense. So going back here to psychoactive drug, if you've ever broken a bone, and all of a sudden you had painkillers, the bone did not miraculously heal. What happened is somewhere along that pathway between the injury and your brain, those neurotransmitters were stopped. So even though that break kept on going, ouch, 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 it never got to the brain where it was received and therefore seen as being painful. So that's how one side where you block those neurotransmitters. And you don't have to know the neurotransmitters of dopamine and I can't think of the other ones right now, but I used to teach a drug education class and we had to memorize all the different neurotransmitters. So the book talks about the difference between addiction and dependence. And you can read what those definitions are. Most people consider them to be synonymous. There's not going to be a test on the exam that asks you the difference between addiction and dependence. So tolerance is when you start using a drug and initially you get that first whatever from that, and then you need more and more to just get to feel normal. And so that happens for a lot of people. So if you know people who are smokers, what's the first thing they do in the morning when they wake up? They get a cigarette and start smoking. Why? Because they've just gone how many ever hours that is without having any nicotine in their system. And their body is crying, hey, get me some nicotine, because they're addicted to it. So they have to smoke just to feel normal. And to get the kick out of that, they have to go even smoke some more or get some more nicotine in themselves. And then withdrawal is when there are physical and psychological issues related to stopping. So if any of you have ever been addicted to caffeine and you stop drinking caffeine, you'll get headaches. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's psychological, and some are even life-threatening. So you want to be aware of that. As I mentioned, my wife is an RN, and there are times where people who are alcoholics come into the hospital and they don't hand out alcohol in the hospital. And after a couple days, they start going through DTs, and people are not very nice when they're going through DTs, from what I've heard. So the APA, the American Psychological Association, if you've ever had to write references or quotes and everything else and all that, part of that is APA. There's MLA and some other forms as well. So there's impaired control, number one. The next is drug effects. So you start developing tolerance. So if you're using some sort of drug and you have tolerance where you need to use more and more of that, I used to do a little bit, a little one do it, but a little got more and more. You're on your way to addiction. And then if you stop for however long, for whatever reason, you start having withdrawal, you're there. And then step number 3, and not everyone gets to number 2 or number 3 or number 4, but are you willing to risk your lives for that? Not everyone who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic. Not everyone who uses illicit drugs becomes a drug addict. But there are those individuals who do. Are you willing to risk your life? So here is step 3, you have social problems. And then number 4, you know what you're doing is causing problems, but you continue it despite. And again, if you ever watch that HBO program, I think it's just called Drugs. I don't remember, but you can Google it. And there were some free videos on there. I mean, you'll see people, their lives are just in shambles. If you ever watch Intervention, same thing. It's like, wow, you've hit rock bottom and you're still digging. So sometimes people do that. They hit rock bottom and they continue digging. So who gets addicted and why? Well, it's hard to determine. So part of it is your personality. Are you a risk taker in life? Do you have a purpose in life? What's your lifestyle like? What's your heredity? There is some genetic links to that. That's not what we're asking on the 5-paragraph essay, not about heredity. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about hypokinetic disease. Are there a number of drugs around you? Growing up as a kid, my parents never had alcohol in the house. I'm a teetotaler. I've never had alcohol my entire life. I've never done an illegal drug. I've never smoked cigarettes. People are like, that's impossible. No, it's not. You just say no and you don't do it. It's not that tough. Not everyone's doing it. We'll see some of the numbers. And then what is the nature of the substance or the behavior, why you're doing that? That can also lead to it. So think about that with your life. This video is amazing. It's a TED Talk, and this guy, Johan Hari, I believe his name is, there's going to be a discussion based on this, but he gives you some cognitive dissonance, what you typically think about the American way of dealing with drugs. I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying you might want to listen to it and then consider the discussion and provide some answers for that. So here is some different drugs about hooked, how America became not drug free, but were, illegal drugs. And here's about marijuana, how those things happen. It's pretty interesting, the history of that. Why was San Francisco the first city in the United States of America Back when all drugs were legal in the 1800s, why did they ban opium? And why was marijuana banned in Arizona and New Mexico, the Southwest? And why was cocaine first banned in the South? Well, you're going to have to investigate and find out if you're really interested in that. It wasn't until 1908, I believe, with Teddy Roosevelt, where illegal drugs first, quote unquote, became illegal. Maybe 1912, one of those two. And up until that time, you could make patent medicine. So if you've ever seen an old movie such as Tombstone, most of you probably haven't, unfortunately for you, uh, where you have a person who goes around in a wagon and they're selling, Doc Weed's cure-all, and there could be opium in it, could be alcohol, could be morphine, it could be a number of things that were in there, and it was legal. You didn't have to write that, and yeah, you wouldn't feel anything. Could be cocaine. Some of you know that Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it. And again, that was legal. It was not illegal to have that. Yeah, Coca-Cola is going to pick you up if there's cocaine in it. But what are the side effects? So going back to that video, the TED Talk, there's some ideas of how drugs work, and he talks about this. And they did some research with rats and everything else. So there's supposedly some of these drugs have very high uh, likelihood of addiction. Again, not everyone who uses heroin, and I'm not saying go out and try this, please. It's dangerous. It's a very dangerous drug, especially if you use needles. Um, it's very high, but not everyone becomes addicted. And then nicotine, morphine, and opium. Both of these are all in the same family, the opioids. So moderate to high, moderate to low, and here's low to very low. And you can see some of these different items that are in here. Look, caffeine right there. Alcohol, moderate. So here are different classifications. You can pause and look at these a little bit closer. They're also in your book. So we have opioids, and you can see the examples here and what they're like. And you hear about the opioid epidemic in our country. So somewhere along the line in medicine, people thought, well, I'm going to have major surgery. I don't want to have any pain. So they started whacking them with all these opioids so that the people would not feel pain. And some people became addicted, unfortunately. And then they either started abusing prescription drugs or they went off market and into illegal drugs. So we have depressants. Those are drugs that slow down the functioning of the brain and the whole system. So alcohol is found in there, and there's other ones that are there. And then you have stimulants, which are the opposite of depressants. They increase. Caffeine is there, and cocaine is there, and a number of other ones. Marijuana and cannabis has its own because it has some different items, what happens to it, depending on the strength. There's K2 and spice, which are synthetic marijuana. Here are hallucinogens, which make you hallucinate. And again, there's LSD and PCP and psilocybin and ketamine and some other ones, ecstasy, MDMA. And so there's different levels of those. All of these are illegal unless you use peyote, which is used for some native populations, their religious ceremonies. And then inhalants is anything that gives off a fume. And again, there's this thing called sudden sniffing death related to that. So who are the drug users? I don't know if you know who these individuals are, but the first question was, do we have mixed messages in our country about drugs and alcohol? And so in the 70s, these guys, Cheech and Chong, they made a lot of movies and kind of glorified smoking dope. And back then, it was not as quote unquote as acceptable. It was not quote unquote legal in some states, medical marijuana. And there's more recent movies that glorify drugs. So if you look at the numbers of people who use self-reported drugs, it's not 100% for any of these. The highest is illicit drugs right here, and then marijuana, hashish. So according to this, 18 to 25-year-olds, less than 1 in 5 use that. So you can see what those numbers are. So not everyone is doing it. Maybe everyone in your peer group, maybe everyone in your community, maybe everyone at your social club, whatever that is, but that's not everyone in the country is using that. And even for tobacco, that's crazy that 1/3 of 18 to 25 use it, even though the health risks have been known for 60 some years, and The tobacco industry lost their lawsuit and had to pay out billions and billions of dollars, but it's still there and people are still using it. Even alcohol, look, not 100% there, 58.3. So there's different numbers for this, never 100%, because people always have a choice to say, no thanks, I don't want to be like everyone else who's acting stupid. And not everyone acts stupid. So you can look at drug overdose deaths from 2000 to 2015. And total, all drugs, look at the prescriptions. A lot of people think, well, the prescriptions drugs, so they're safe. They're just as harmful as illegal. They just happen to have a prescription on them. Your friendly neighborhood drug dealer, though, doesn't say, hey, take 2 of these and call me in the morning. More than likely, where a medical professional will, and they'll think about and ask you what other chemicals you are using. Your friendly neighborhood drug dealer doesn't ask, hey, what other meds are you using? No, you can't have these because they're trying to make money on you. And then look at illicit opioids. That's heroin and fentanyl. And where do most of those come from? Well, they come from illegally through our borders. We're not very effective at preventing that. So what's the best way to prevent substance abuse and use? Unfortunately, there is no single best method. Do scare tactic works for people? Back in the 80s, it was just say no. Was that effective for everyone? No. Do scare tactics work? Yeah, they work for people who are already not going to use them. They're like, listen, that's why I don't want to use them because, look, bad things happen to you. But there are still those people who are like, well, it's not going to happen to me, or I don't care what's going to happen. I'm going to do it anyhow. You know, the junior high rebel without a clue. So think about it. What is the role of drugs in your life? As soon as you have pain, do you run to the medicine cabinet and try to take something to alleviate that, or do you come up with something else? If you can't fall asleep, do you try to go find some sort of sleep aid? So, how do you feel about that? And then, what are the issues dealing with that? You know, if you become addicted or develop tolerance for some type of drug and you go to the hospital because you're in pain, some of those, there's this thing called cross tolerance where you will be unable to manage the pain because your body has already developed tolerance and the powerful drugs they're giving to you will not be very effective. That's a true story. I'm not making that up. So you want to be aware, if you ever need that, do you want to have that ability to kill the pain? So alcohol is probably the most prevalent drug, and it's age restricted and is part of our society. Think about how many different celebrations of life where alcohol is used. It's ethyl alcohol, and talk about purity proof and percent alcohol. And most drinks, whether it is liquor, beer, or wine, are about 0.6 ounces of alcohol in a standard drink. Now, obviously, if you're drinking pure grain alcohol, that's going to be higher than 0.06. So all of these pack the same punch in terms of your blood alcohol content. So what are the factors that determine what your blood alcohol content is? Think about that as we move forward. So what are they? It's the amount of alcohol based on the time that it's consumed and your body mass. There is some role of gender involved in that, supposedly, and I don't know, but I've heard research that women, depending on what part of their menstrual cycle are, that will have an impact, a slight impact on their blood alcohol content. So you can see what happens. Even at 0.02, relaxation, mild euphoria, reduced inhibition, decreased alertness, impaired motor coordination, and judgment. And that takes about 2 to 3 hours. So think about that. With one drink, you're going to have impaired motor ability and impaired reduced inhibitions, decreased alertness. So you're not going to be as effective, even though that's below the legal limit. Look at the 0.05 to 0.10, and 0.08 is now the legal limit. You can see what's happening there. Emotional instability, exaggerated feelings and behaviors. For whatever reason, when I was younger, a teenager in high school, I hung out with some guys who drank, and there's some crazy stories that go along with that, which I'm not going to share. But there were some of my friends, when they started drinking, they got beer muscles. They became really tough. And then other ones, they would beer goggle and other things. Some would get very emotional, and it was just crazy. You know, they're putting their arm around you, you're your best friend ever. And if they were stone cold sober, they never even look at you or, talk to you because you're below them. And ultimately, as it goes up, we have respiratory arrest and death because it's a depressant. It slows down the functioning of the central nervous system. Please don't whip this out the next time you go out and you decide to drink and drive. Have a designated driver or call Lyft or whatever the other one is. I can't think of it right now. But don't be stupid. Don't pull this chart out and say, well, WeDirect said I'm legal because I weigh 135 pounds and I had 2 drinks and I'm okay. I'm below, because you don't know how much alcohol the bartender, the mixologist, was giving you. So maybe they gave you a little bit more than 1 serving and boom, that impacted that. So be aware, this gives an estimated BAC. And are you really timing your drinks like that? So as stated, here are some of the immediate effects of alcohol consumption. And all of you probably know people, you don't have to name yourself, based on reduced inhibitions that have done some ridiculous things. Binge drinking is when you have 5 drinks in a row for men or 4 drinks in a row for women within 2 hours. So that's a lot of alcohol in a small amount of time, going to spike up the blood alcohol content, cause some decision-making problems. And if you look at these numbers right here, that's a lot of college-age people, and there's a lot of colleges that have problems with students who drink too much and have physical problems, emotional problems, legal problems, etc. So don't be that individual. Moving on to tobacco, you should have known about this. So be smart. Don't smoke. Don't smoke, dip, or chew, or go out with any individuals who do. So you can look at the ratings here of the people who do smoke. And I don't know what that has to do with anything else, but you can see what your ethnic background is. And then you can see with the education level. Interestingly, GED are the individuals who have the highest rate of smoking. So nicotine is an addictive drug. So if you vape, still has nicotine in it, still has the chemical effects and all of the harsh things that nicotine does to the body. So this has become very popular. Supposedly it's age restricted. I don't think it's 21 like tobacco now became 21. And I don't smoke. I never smoked. I think it's a unhealthy thing to do, and I would never do it. But I don't think that you should have to be 21. I think if you're 18, you can do that. And if you want to smoke and you want to own a bar or a restaurant and allow people to do that, people can choose by either showing up or not showing up. But that's just me. That's my libertarian nature coming out. So the last chapter is STIs, sexually transmitted infections. And if we go back to chapter 13, are you going to be impairing your decision making, which might increase the risk of exposure to STIs? That's why these two are linked. So explain how HIV is transmitted. I told you one of the 4 reasons why this is a class is because of HIV, and we'll talk about that. What are some other major STIs? And how can you protect yourself from getting those? So an STI or STD, they used to be called sexually transmitted diseases. So if I forget and call it an STD, you know I mean STIs. Back in the old days, they were called venereal disease. So I couldn't help it. I saw that. It was creepy and I thought it was funny. So it's a little bit awkward. So think to yourself, when it comes to sexual practices, is there such a thing as safe sex? You have that answer? Okay, so let's proceed. So here are the major STIs. You can see down here, HPV is the most prevalent. This is according to 2013. And the cases that you see that are going to be numbered, these are documented cases. You don't know how many people have these. Some are asymptomatic and they're running around without being diagnosed and spreading to other people potentially. So these are the new cases every year that are reported. So remember, I said this is one of the 4. I mean, this is tragic that 37,600 people, but here's 14 million. Why don't we have a better information about that. Obviously, this is potentially fatal and it doesn't go away. Well, this doesn't go away. Any of the viruses are going to be treatable. They're not curable at this time. So there are differences between males and females. There's a slide coming up here to know the difference. So be aware of that. And part of the reason why women are hit harder by STIs because most of the reproductive organs are internal. And then also there's still a social stigma. Without answering this out loud or putting this into discussion, what are the names for a female who like to have multiple sexual partners? Okay, if you thought of those, do you want your mom to be called that? Do you want your sister to be called that? Do you want your best female friend to be called that? Do you want your girlfriend or wife? Probably not. Okay, same question for males. What's the name for that? And does that have the same social stigma as the female version? Probably not. I know there are terms for males, but they're not the same, which is part of the way our society has been. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's just what it is, what it is. So again, male has mainly external and females are mainly internal. There are a lot of similarities between males and females. We both have two, not sex organs, sexual glands that produce our part to contribute to offspring, correct? And so there are many similarities, so you want to be aware of that. And as I used to tell my junior high students, most people, when they have sex, they don't want to procreate, they want to recreate, they want to have fun. So the better you understand yourself and your partner, the more fun it can be. And also potentially prevent any type of procreation. So one of the things about sexual contact, when you're having sexual contact with someone, it's like having sexual contact with everyone that they've had sexual contact with before, and that can spread out exponentially. So I have a friend that I used to teach with and coach with, and I don't know, but he reported that he had over 100 sexual partners. So if you think about that, each time he started a new sexual relationship with someone, he was carrying a couple busloads of people that he had contact with. And I'm going to assume most of the people that he had sexual contact with, they had previous partners as well. You understand how that web could explode out. So are you willing to have a sexual experience with someone and trust the person back here in this very back bus that you've never met before, you're never going to meet in your entire life with your health and well-being? Me personally, no, but we have decisions to make. So being educated about that, that's important why we talk about this. And you've had this before, and there are resources at the county level and the state level where you can go there, get free testing, etc., to figure that out. But you want to be aware, and the more you know, hopefully the less likely you are to become infected. So early diagnosis and treatment are important so that you know, but unfortunately, a lot of STIs are asymptomatic. That means you have it, you don't know it, and you could honestly tell someone, hey, I don't have any STIs. You got them a nice Hallmark card, and you said, listen, I don't have any, etc., without getting tested, and they believe you, and you actually share something with them. And if you think about it, if someone has an STI, usually you think that person's dirty. I usually do that in my class, in the classroom setting, where I'll go up and I'll just shake someone's hand. I'm like, hey, I'm weed, I have syphilis. And that's usually how you're not going to address someone, right? Because that means you're dirty and you're the scourge of society, etc. You're a leper, so to speak. But if you look, 1 in 4 Americans supposedly at some point in their life is going to have an STI. So in a class of 25 students, that's 6 students in every class that I teach that has 25 students. That's a lot of people. So prevention, the only 100% is abstinence. That's where there's no sexual activity whatsoever. And most people don't choose that. So you want to plan for safer sex. So I asked earlier, is there such a thing as safe sex? If you think so, have you ever seen genital warts? Because genital warts can spread outside the area. I would not suggest that you Google it, but if you want to, you're going to get an eyeful. But there are people who are walking around right now who have genital warts. They're not going to get it treated, and they're just hoping and wishing that it goes away. So you could have genital warts outside. Ever see herpes? That spreads outside the area that a condom is going to cover. So you could have a condom on and still pass herpes to each other. And condoms are not effective. So when you look at a condom's effectiveness rate, that is the rate for um, pregnancy. And a woman can only get pregnant a few days, hours, depending on how you want to look at that, out of a month. Once the eggs release travels down the fallopian tube, there's an opportune time where a sperm can fertilize it. If not, then boom, no pregnancy. So you want to be aware of this. If you're diagnosed, you want to share, get treated as quickly as possible. I have one of my college roommates, he had a stepbrother, and the stepbrother, when he started a new relationship, he'd go get tested, and then he'd give the new partner a clean bill of health. Say, here you go. And I said, as I mentioned before, have you put that in a Hallmark card? So HIV is the big one right now, human immunodeficiency virus, and AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. So you can be HIV positive, but you don't have AIDS. And so you can see the number, and it was first diagnosed in the early 80s. So when I was in high school, it was called AIDS and the AIDS virus, but it has changed since then. But in the United States of America, the survivability rate is much higher. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people because we have more medicines. But if you look at what AIDS has done in sub-Saharan Africa, not a real good thing. So is everyone at risk for HIV infection? Think about that. Are you at risk? Am I at risk? Are our mothers at risk? Are our fathers at risk? Our cousins, aunts, uncles? So again, I would say it depends. So my wife and I were in a mutually monogamous relationship. Neither of us have HIV. Neither of us shoot IV drugs. So I would say I am not at risk for HIV. Now, true, she is an RN, and theoretically she could get stuck and get it that way, but there's a lot of things that they do where they minimize that. So it all depends on your behavior. What are you doing? And we'll talk about what those behaviors are. So if you keep on ticking off, okay, that behavior, I do that, yeah, you're at risk. It all depends on what your behaviors are. There's consequences to our behaviors. That's all I'm going to say. So what happens is the human immunodeficiency virus affects your white blood cells. And then what happens if you don't get treatment, it eventually diminishes the ability of your white blood cell to fight off disease or secondary opportunistic infections, and you die from that. So many of you have probably seen Bohemian Rhapsody about Freddie Mercury, who died the year that I was student teaching. And so he became infected, and at the time treatment was not very good, and he died from whether it was some sort of cancer or pneumonia or whatever that was. I didn't watch the movie. And look, you can be asymptomatic for 2 to 20 years. So again, you could honestly think that you don't have it because you don't have any symptoms and still spread it. So here are things that you can do to prevent. Some of those I mentioned. So avoid sexual contact with someone who has HIV. And if there's commercials on TV about using some pre-exposure type of drug for that, avoid anal and vaginal intercourse. If you have intercourse, use a condom of some sort, and then also use a dental dam for oral genital, oral anal sexual contact. So you can see what are the behaviors. No risk, right here is abstinence, and then you keep on seeing here. So HIV is passed through blood, semen, and breast milk. And mothers who are HIV positive, I believe there's some sort of drug that it takes so they don't spread it to their offspring. And you can see who are at the highest risk. So MSM is men having sex with other men, men having sex with other men who are IV drug users. Here's IV drug users. And then almost a quarter are in the heterosexual population. So you want to be aware of what's going on with that and what your risks are. So like I said, there's blood products. Now the blood is safe. They test that. When you give blood, they ask you a bunch of questions. And then they also check that as well. But in the early 80s, again, there was a kid, I think his name was Ryan White. I can't remember. I could be wrong about that name. Don't quote me on that. Where he was a hemophiliac and he received HIV positive blood, back then AIDS virus, and He died from AIDS. So here are different types of things that you can do to minimize your risk and educate yourself. So if you shoot IV drugs, again, that is something that is available. We could have a discussion, should municipalities and cities and states give uh, needles, IV needles, to drug users so that they're not spreading the disease. That's a difficult decision. And then here are some of the symptoms. And again, first few weeks, fever, fatigue, rashes, headaches, swollenness, and that would be, all of us have experienced many of these things when we were sick, correct? So the person thinks they're sick, they don't know that they came in contact with it, and eventually, if they don't get treatment, and the drugs, they have some nasty side effects there. So don't think, oh yeah, if I get it, exposed to it, I'll just take the drugs. They're expensive and they have some nasty side effects, just like every drug does. And so you have to get tested, and they figure that out. So look, being tested once is not enough. So there's antiviral drugs, and then the reverse transcriptase inhibitors, protease inhibitors, integrase inhibitors, and entry inhibitors. So there's a lot of meds, and they have to figure out what that correct cocktail is for individuals. And for some individuals, for whatever reason, it's not as effective as others. Look, the best hope for stopping the spread of HIV is a safe, effective, and inexpensive vaccine, which doesn't exist right now. So you're taking a risk. So there are other STIs that are out there that you want to become familiar with. HPV is one of those big ones. When you were young, you could have gotten shots to help prevent that, because HPV can cause sterility in females and males. Many of those STIs will cause sterility in females, whether it's detected or undetected. But it's based on the decision. So thinking about tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and sexual contact, how do these impact the behaviors? Going to our activity. Are you more physically literate now than when you started? Hopefully. And then, can you explain how HIV is transmitted, diagnosed, and treated? Discuss the symptoms, risks, and treatments of other major STIs. So the exposure is the same. And then, what can you do to protect yourself from STIs? There are 2 videos here at the end. Faces of Meth, and then 100 Years of Drug in America, Coffee to Heroin. Okay, that does it for all of the chapters. There is a review, which we will eventually have, and then there's a final, and it'll tell you the breakdown of numbers. Move well, move often.